And I thought, well, this is kind of odd. And then I thought, I wonder if some of the same dynamics are at play in this vision of rugged masculinity as we, as historians of gender and power, have analyzed in the Roosevelt era. And so that's kind of the questions that I brought to that text. And I went on and I read, and it was this very militaristic conception of Christian manhood, right? And this was in the early years of the Iraq War, too. And so I was also seeing all the survey data coming my way that white evangelicals, outliers, in terms of support for the Iraq War, support for preemptive war in general, condoning the use of torture. So I just thought, what might one of these things have to do with the other? But I also noticed something else. That all of the heroes in these books, in Eldridge's book, and because that would go on to sell more than 4 million copies, it spawned a cottage industry of copycat books. Same cast of heroes, same quote, it was like plagiarism. It was plagiarism, and somehow this all worked. I was sorely tempted at that point in time to adopt a pen name. I was thinking Chuck would be a good one. Chuck Steele was going to be my pen name, and I could turn these things out. I knew the formula; it was so easy. All the same guys. But what I noticed is that they were all white. All of them were white, and they were white guys who were proving their heroism often by subduing non-white populations. As a historian, I noticed that, and as a historian who was trained to look at not just gender but also race. Because early in my grad school career, I had been taught that gender is always connected to race. I remember writing that down, like in my notebook, and having to spit that back, for comps and stuff. And I remember like accepting it because I was taught that. But deep inside, I was like, really? Is it though? Is it always connected to race? But it was the truth that was handed to me, so I thought, okay, we'll go with it. Gender is always connected to race. If you're white, it may not seem like it always is. But if you have eyes to see, you can start to see some of these connections. Now, back then, I was busy. I was having a baby, then I had another baby, and I was working on another project. And so I ended up setting this project aside for a time. I had questions about, first of all, what I was uncovering was really upsetting, disturbing. This was the height of the Driscoll era, Doug Wilson. And it was just really disgusting, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to spend the years of my life that it would take to write this book.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. This is Fringe Stories, and I hope that you're doing fine wherever you are today. There's something important that I would like to bring to your attention, and this is about the early churches, white evangelical churches, and the role that they played in discriminating, hindering black people from accessing certain things. For example, we had white churches which was against black activists, which was against the civil rights movements of the people from the black community. And you realize that this is a topic that we really need to talk about because it's really intriguing. And so if we see white people coming out and trying to talk about this topic today, this is, mostly it's driven by guilt that people who were there before did, and also we have some people who just want to do right. And so in today's presentation, we have these not African American, but this white professor I'm going to note down his name. I'll write down his name, or maybe you can just say it down there. I've written it already. So you realize that people from the black community were not allowed to get into these churches, not only just to worship, in the white churches. So you realize how devastating that was. Apart from that, I would like to bring to your attention the fact that most of these people, it wasn't just for everybody. They did this thing for their own self, advantage. So talking about the place or the role of white churches in perpetuating racism, perpetuating slavery. This is an important topic that I believe that we need to talk about as people from the black community, because I'm affected, you are also affected, and I believe that we can have a discourse about this. Presenting such kind of topics, it's important, and this also tells you that our church is a powerful place. Where you can find a number of people today collectively sitting down, apart from lecture halls, people who need these, people who need to get this history right, people who need to be educated, mostly are people in the church, because most of the people are looking up to certain kind of people, and when they're looking up to certain kind of people, these people don't probably know about much about these things. So I believe that these discussions are places where we need to have people talk about them, especially in the churches. Church is a good place of talking about these topics, because that's where the hypocrisy is hidden. That's where people who pretend are. So if you can find a platform, and I thank these not African American, I don't know why I keep on saying African American or Black American. What I think about, why I thank this professor for coming out and talking about these in a church, it's because these things were conducted in the white churches, and there is no big difference from you can say that you believe in God and that what you practice is inhumane, so just gotta hit them right on their face. And so I believe that she did the right thing, getting to talk about this topic in the church. Church is really a good place, and it is high time people who go to church, we need to start talking about these topics inside the church, because they are really, really important. Trust me when I say they are really important, because they play a magnificent role in highlighting the systemic issues that were not being talked about, things that were condoned to talk about in the church, while the politicians are allowed, even today, are allowed to talk in front of people inside churches. But certain kind of topics, they are called unholy topics because they expose the truth. While people allow people allow people who have their own, interest to talk about this topic. So honestly, I'm really intrigued, and I'm happy that we are having this discussion. I mean, what a point, what a good time to be alive. Seeing justice prevail, seeing the truth coming to the light. As they say, the truth shall always set you free. And I'm really glad that I'm alive at this time, and I get to see this happening. So I don't want to say much. This is just the introductory part, and I'll just want to tell you that I'm going to do a commentary in between the videos and also at the end of the video, so that I can comply with YouTube policies, so that YouTube doesn't get to fire me, right? So let's dive right into the video. And if you're watching this video for the first time, you can definitely consider subscribing to the channel, join the membership, really get to see what I can offer you. Until then, let's dive right into it.
I had, again, other stuff going on, and I had this nagging question: is this mainstream or is this fringe? Because it felt really extremist, what I was reading, deeply misogynistic, militaristic, and I just didn't know what to do with it. And I thought, okay, I'll set it aside. We'll see what happens. I did set it aside until 2016. And Beth actually mentioned in her intro to me that blog post that I wrote, and then I ended up, I was all over the media to have to talk about Trump's linguistic style, because I had done a linguistic analysis, comparative analysis of their speeches, and I brought religion into it. And so this was my first live television interview, national interview, CTV, which happened to be the day after the Access Hollywood tape released. I was supposed to be going on to talk about Trump's linguistic style, and all of a sudden we had the grab him by the pussy out there. I thought, you've got to be kidding me. And then there was a hurricane bearing down. And so it was very stressful. I did go on live TV. I delivered it, and they ended up asking me about the software I had used to analyze the linguistic structure, which caught me off guard, but was easier to address than Access Hollywood at that point. Anyway, I digress. But the Access Hollywood tape released, and you remember the conversation nationally and in evangelical spaces. What are evangelicals going to do? We're weeks away from the election. Evangelicals were backing Trump in dramatic numbers, but surely this was a step too far, right? And no, a couple wavered ever so briefly, and then right back supporting Trump. And what I noticed is that the language that I heard evangelicals use to describe their support for Donald Trump sounded an awful lot like what I had been reading all those years ago in books on Christian manhood. A man is tough, he's rugged, he's filled with testosterone, and testosterone comes with certain side effects. But that's a blessing from God. Aggression is a blessing, and it just has to be channeled. A real man will do what needs to be done. He's not going to be cowed by political correctness. And I heard them talk about Trump as their ultimate fighting champion. He's going to protect Christianity. He's going to protect Christian America. And I thought, oh, I've heard this before. I think I know what's happening. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I think I started to understand that all this talk in the media and in evangelical spaces about the betrayal of evangelical values was missing part of the picture. This was not a betrayal of all of their values. We needed to take a closer look at exactly what evangelicals were valuing. Okay, so I dusted off those old files, and I decided to look to the history. I knew what I was seeing in the early 2000s, and as a historian, okay, where did this come from? So I went back to the history, and by this point I knew what I was looking at was white evangelical masculinity. And history made that abundantly clear, because when I traced back this more recent iteration of rugged Christian manhood, I had to go back to the Cold War era. And that's where you can see this militarism and Christian nationalism coming together with gender traditionalism. So that made sense. It was against the backdrop of feminism. It was part of an anti-feminist movement. What else is happening during that time? It's also the civil rights movement, right? And when we look at these family values evangelicals, we see that they are often the same people who are against the civil rights movement. And it's not just the same people who happen to be doing these things, but if you look at some of the core issues among family values evangelicals, you'll see that it's also about race. It's not just about gender, and it's not just about sexuality, right? So we could look at the context of desegregation. That's when we start hearing conservative white evangelicals really emphasizing parental authority. And by parental authority, mind you, this is patriarchal authority, right? Because we know who has the authority in that relationship. So the authority of parents to make decisions for their kids without federal government interference. That had a very specific meaning in the 1960s, didn't it? And notice, it's just talking about parental authority, but are they talking and defending the authority of black parents to make decisions about their kids' education? Of course not. Race is not visible, except it is if you're not white. You can see this, right? But the language is masking it. And it on the surface doesn't seem to be about race at all. So that's this family values. We could talk about Bob Jones University and their case to protect their right for segregation against government interference and tax exemption. Even if we look at things like versus the hippies and the activists at that time, hippies were anathema They messed up gender roles. The men had long hair and wore flowered shirts, and everything was all messed up, and they weren't fighting for their country like real men ought to be. And the antidote to that was an enforcement of law and order. Law and order was to crack down against those hippies and against civil rights activists, right? But law and order politics sounds like a pretty decent thing. Law, order, good things, right? But you have to understand the context, deeply racialized context. So this is back in the 1960s into the 1970s when evangelicals begin to mobilize politically in this partisan direction that we're familiar with today. And this is where John Wayne comes in. So I didn't set out to write a book about race. I also very much did not set out to write a book about John Wayne. I'm as surprised as anyone. And of course, this isn't really a book about John Wayne, but we can learn some things from John Wayne. And Aldrich didn't actually include John Wayne in his pantheon of heroes, but a whole lot of other writers did and continue to do so. John Wayne is the icon of American manhood, and America and Christianity are one of the same, and he's the icon of what it is to be a real man, a good Christian man. So when I looked at John Wayne, historically too, it's really important to realize how he became an icon of American manhood. And he became an icon of conservative, white American manhood, okay? In the 1960s. I mean, he was a hero before then, but he becomes this symbol, this icon, as time goes by. What do we know about John Wayne? For Wayne, toughness was a virtue. And he becomes this emblem, so much so that critics of U.S. foreign policy in the 60s and 70s said that America was afflicted with John Wayne syndrome, right? It became this symbol, and everyone knew what he was talking about. John Wayne's masculinity, on screen and off, as we'll see, was unapologetically imperialist. Think about all of his greatest hits. They involve valiant white men battling and usually subduing non-white populations, right? Japanese, Native Americans, Vietnamese, Mexicans. That was his heroic masculinity. It was a distinctly white male ideal. His own views on race, if you've happened to read the 1971 issue of Playboy, you'll be familiar with these. As he put it, I believe in white supremacy until the blacks are educated to a point of responsibility. I don't believe in giving authority and positions of leadership and judgment to irresponsible people. On Native Americans, I don't feel we did wrong in taking this great country away from them. Our so-called stealing of this country from them was just a matter of survival. Whose survival? People needed land, and the Indians were selfishly trying to keep it for themselves. He also downplayed the My Lai massacre, and he was a staunch proponent of law and order. He symbolized this throwback masculinity, this retrograde masculinity, this white patriarchal power, on screen and off, the way things ought to be. So that's the John Wayne. What we can see in this image of John Wayne, again, I read the parts where race is explicit, but you have to read Playboy to get some of these eloquent articulations. But think about the iconic image that his films presented. If you don't have eyes to see, it can be easy to miss that. But when evangelicals today are saying this John Wayne America, this John Wayne masculinity, right? This is what they're talking about, part of what they're talking about. Okay, so I went back to history and I started to see the ways in which race were often just beneath the surface when we're talking about masculinity, when we're talking about gender. Then let's jump to the 1990s, because the 1990s is a really interesting decade. And that's the decade in particular where I feel like everything's up for grabs. In the 1990s, what's happening? The Cold War came to an end, right? So that kind of frees evangelicals up to say, what is our politics? who are we supposed to be in this world? What is our purpose now? For so long, it's been anti-communist, have kind of grounded evangelical politics in so many ways, foreign policy and domestically. So that's up for grabs. And what we see is this really interesting moment. When I read evangelical literature in the 1990s, the one word that keeps popping up is confusion. Confusion. What do we do now? Who are we? What does it mean to be a Christian man? What does it mean to be a man at all? And this is when we have some answers. Promisekeepers came around. Okay, show of hands. How many of you attended a Promisekeepers rally? Okay, we've got good representation here. So, Promisekeepers, what can we say about Promisekeepers? It was many things to many people, right? The movement itself was somewhat confused. You had like pretty strict patriarchalists there, and you can find Promisekeeper literature, women's submission, male headship, leadership, all of the kind of traditional, quote-unquote, traditional patriarchal gender roles. You can find that there. You can find it the whole spectrum, though. You can also find egalitarian teachings. And mostly what you find is somewhere in between. You have a patriarchy, but it's a soft patriarchy. We need warriors, but we need tender warriors. They're kind of feeling their way out. There's something new. The old masculinity isn't cutting it anymore. And so it's a time of contradictory messages and experimentation. This is also when we see sports metaphors really taking center stage, and sometimes explicitly setting aside the military ones. So you have somebody like Ralph Reed saying, "Oh, look, we got to drop all these military metaphors now. They aren't really playing the same way. Sports is where it is." And sports function in kind of the same ways. You've got the good guys and the bad guys, and it takes strength, and you've got a winner and a loser, and things like that. So, but still, it was a noticeable shift. Now, this is when we, not coincidentally, I think, also see
So probably I know that many white churches, especially in the South, endorsed and supported slavery. In what way? The theological works that people do, especially white scholars, white preachers, how they portrayed black people and how they presented the image of a black person in front of the white audience. Because remember, in the past, black people were not sitting together with white people in the same church. If they were allowed to sit in the same church, we could have two different groups: white congregation, black congregation, and then we have the main, the part that usually church has. So, or worse, that could be black people could just be outside the church while white people are inside the church, or white people in front of the church, black people at the back of the church. And if you think that I'm lying, check out during the 1940s in the South how the churches really operated. There's a documentary. I wish I could remember the name of the channel. I can't remember the name of the channel, but if I kind of remember, I'll write in my community so that people are following up can really go to see what really happened. So there were some theological justifications that these people started coming up with. This theological justification curtailed the true representation of black people. Black people now started seeing themselves as subhumans, because even the Bible, the interpretations of the Bible during those times, how they gave the interpretation of the Bible was really unprecedented, was really unquote. It was something which today it's really unappreciable. So I understand and I agree that it is right to, it is right to right the wrongs, right? And the first thing, and I usually say this, the first thing to right the wrongs is by accepting that there is a problem. And this is where this professor comes from. She really understands the atrocities that were done to black people. And I said, black people are always segregated in the churches. Tell me where you say that you are praising a living God, yet you dividing people, you segregating people. You practice Jim Crow in churches. Does that really make sense to you? Does it really make sense to you? For me, I think that's some crazy level of hypocrisy that I'm getting to see right now. Because you can't tell me that God loves us all, and then in the church, you're literally separating black people from, white people from black people. What do you think these people really feel about it? How do they perceive this? What's their psychological understanding of how you people do these things? It's really crazy, right? So that's how crazy it was. There was slavery inside churches, really do. And I've said some scriptures were misinterpreted at the advantage of white people, and white evangelists participated in this. How crazy it might sound, but it is the truth. So let's continue watching the video. Sorry for interruptions, but I have to do that.
Movement towards quote unquote racial reconciliation, right? When you get rid of the more militaristic and harder patriarchy and go for something kinder, gentler, you're using the sports metaphors, this is also when we see an opening towards inviting black men into these spaces. When for a long time, black men had been perceived as threats, right? That's where the law and order comes in. And now inviting into these spaces. And so in the 1990s, the Promisekeepers movement was the largest Christian organization to pursue racial reconciliation in the country. And for many of the men involved, it was an absolutely authentic effort. Now, I use the words racial reconciliation, which, as we heard Dr. Foley say earlier today or yesterday, that this has fallen out of favor. But this is the words they used, and they used them intentionally so. What did racial reconciliation look like in the Promisekeepers movement? It looked like inviting black pastors onto the stage, right? And men like Tony Evans were there. Sometimes John Perkins was too. And it looked like talking about the wrongs that were done mutually. And so white men apologized to black men, and black men apologized to white men in some of these settings. And in more cases than not, racism was defined as personal, not as structural or systemic. It was an individual sin that needed to be confessed for reconciliation to be achieved. And in that moment, at that time, African American pastors critiqued the movement for precisely this: the unwillingness to engage in the systemic and structural issues, that racism was not just a personal issue, and it certainly wasn't a kind of equally mutual problem. And so there were tensions within the movement around this. And again, you have somebody like John Perkins, who had a voice in this. And he was the most radical one, certainly, in pointing towards structural and systemic racism. He had an essay in the 1996 Go the Distance Promisekeepers volume. It's an unsparing critique of white Christianity, one that you would not find today in the Promisekeepers literature, or in fact in most white evangelical spaces, certainly not in recent years. Even though, and that was the exception, absolute exception. Most of it was this reconciliation, mutual confession, and not looking at structural racism. Even in that very diluted form, it was too much for many evangelical men. As McCartney said, it was simply too hard of a teaching for too many. The Promisekeepers movement was overwhelmingly white, more than 90% white, and many leaders, including McCartney himself, see the decline of the movement as linked to the emphasis on racial reconciliation, even the mild personal form. In 1996, for example, 40% of the complaints that were registered by men who attended the national conference were negative responses to the theme of racial reconciliation. 40% of the complaints. McCartney says the focus on race was a major factor in the significant fall-off in attendance after that. Now, I say this because this is important, I think, to understand how race functions in evangelical spaces. There are authentic efforts to work towards racial healing, if you will, racial justice, racial reconciliation, and they all mean different things. And they are often very limited, problematic, and even those are often resisted, powerfully resisted. What we see happening in the 1990s is we go from this moment of possibility, seeming turning away from culture wars politics, turning away from the Cold War mentalities, talking about the global persecution of Christians and anti-trafficking activism and racial reconciliation. It really felt like evangelicalism was moving in a very different direction. And then the pendulum starts to swing back. And you see leaders say, things are getting a little too soft here. We need to toughen up, right? We need to train men up. The culture wars are not done. Right? There's a war for the soul of the nation going on. Oh, and the Clintons are in the White House. That's super helpful to kind of shore up this militancy once again. And so by the end of the 1990s, you see the pendulum swinging back to a more aggressive white masculinity. And so by 2001, John Eldredge's Wild at Heart is on the shelves of bookstores, and his is not the only one. There's several books that are swinging back towards this testosterone-driven masculinity. And those books are on the shelves of Christian bookstores when terrorists strike the United States on September 11, 2001. Every man has a battle to fight. It was not metaphorical anymore. And what you can see is, time and again, like evangelicalism doesn't exist outside of its culture, right? Civil rights movement, Cold War, it's very influenced, this John Wayne conservative masculinity, it feeds into evangelicalism and then it gets embraced and then it changes evangelicalism and then evangelicalism feeds back out into the rest of culture. And these books, like Eldredge's, resonated within evangelical spaces and far beyond evangelical spaces too. And this is where we see John Wayne returning in the context of the Iraq War, this image of the powerful, traditional American man who will save America, who will save Christian America. In the early 2000s, that's when I first started paying attention to all of this, and that's where we see this return to warrior masculinity. And it's really a warrior masculinity on steroids, because this is when we don't just have the Eldredge version, the Braveheart William Wallace. This is when we get the Mark Driscoll extremism, and this is when Doug Wilson moves from the shadows into more of the mainstream. It's also when we have the rise of Islamophobia, and again, non-white men being seen as threats that must be subdued and then preemptively attacked in the name of defense. And then we have 2008, the election of Barack Hussein Obama. And when you look back in time, it was such a jarring moment, not just for conservative white Americans who held explicitly racist views, although it was that. It was also a challenge to many of the ideals that didn't even seem to be race-based at all. And for conservative white evangelicals in particular, they saw the survey data coming out of that election of 2008, and they saw a small but significant number of young white evangelicals who defected and voted for Barack Hussein Obama. And they noticed that, and they were explicit about doing whatever it took to take them back into the fold. And they were relentless, men like James Dobson, critiquing, disparaging President Obama during those years. And
Also, I would like to bring to your attention that some white churches engaged in missionary work, right? That sounds good, but Why do we have the missionary work in enslaved people? The level of hypocrisy. You find people working on the farms, and then now you want to start preaching to them the God, and these people, you literally enslaving them, and then you want to preach to them about the God. There is a disconnect, right? So, black people, I understand that they were aiming to convert them. They were aiming to erase the spirituality that really black people had. But at that, in what expense were they doing that to black people? At what expense? I know you'll ask yourself that question. At the expense of treating them badly. That's why you see some people today, they still question religion. It is a misunderstanding that these people use the scriptures to their advantage. So evangelism often reinforces subservience and obedience rather than promoting equality or freedom. Also, they came to say it, oh, we need a social order. Now we will start telling these people that, you need to be humble, God will help you, while they are not applying the same to them. So you realize how crazy it is. And also, I would like to bring to your point how the church also participated in post-Civil War reconstruction. After the Civil War, during the reconstruction, there were attempts to integrate churches, but these were largely unsuccessful. White churches generally resisted integration and segregated congregation. People, they feared losing. They felt like they have the power, right? So during the post-Civil War and Reconstruction, there was a suggestion that we need to come together, right? Stop the segregation. But we have some white churches. That's why God will judge you so fiercely. God will really judge you so fiercely. That's why people are coming up with ways of now reconstructing the society, because of the post-Civil War that happened. We have white churches which refused to accept black people and white people to sit together in the churches because of why. I mean, why do you think they refused? I really want to know. Tell me why. And I think this is really common, right? They felt like they are superior.
It's in the 2000s, really, that I want to think just for a bit. It's recent enough memory that some of us here remember that time to think about this question that I had initially pondered when I started this research, and that is the relationship between the mainstream and the fringe. And I think the 2000s provide an interesting case study here in a couple of different ways. So just one example of how I was trying to tease this out. In my book, I had zero intention of talking about Bill Gothard in my book when I first started. He's fringe, right? Total fringe. I didn't want people to write off my book to accuse me of just focusing on the fringe, right? So I'm like, not going to touch Gothard. And then I started talking to people like, oh, what's your book on? And I was like, oh, masculinity. And like, you're going to talk about Bill Gothard, aren't you? I heard that so many times from people that I considered totally mainstream, fellow academics, people I didn't know came from very conservative spaces. So I was like, okay, let me take a look. I ended up saying, yeah, I need to. I saw just how many millions his work reached. And then I held him up next to somebody like James Dobson, indisputably mainstream evangelicals. In fact, I say you can't write a history of white evangelicalism of the last half century without giving James Dobson a pretty prominent space. And then I compared what they were saying, and there was an awful lot of overlap between Bill Gothard and James Dobson. And then evangelicals are promiscuous readers, right? They're going to take a bit here, a bit there, and then it's all going to kind of resonate. And so this, what is fringe? What is mainstream? And then what is the relationship between the mainstream and the fringe? In the 2000s, the most interesting figure for me with respect to this question is Doug Wilson. Now, I don't know how many of you know who Doug Wilson is. If you don't, that's totally fine. Don't look him up. For those of you who do. Okay, Doug Wilson. In the 1990s, he would have been offended if you called him mainstream. Still today, he would be offended. Right? Despises mainstream evangelicals. That's not who he is. He was, I'll stick with the historical, blatantly racist, sexist, misogynistic, arguably, as I argue, condoned abuse, covered up for abuse, blamed women for sexual abuse. Okay, this is Doug Wilson. He wrote a book, Southern Slavery as It Was, which questioned the supposed brutalities, immoralities, and cruelties of slavery. The slave trade, he conceded, might be unbiblical, but slavery most certainly was not. He accused abolitionists of being driven by a zealous hatred of the Word of God. They spread propaganda and falsehoods. In fact, the life of the slave had been a life of plenty, of ample food, of good medical care, and simple pleasures, marked by a degree of mutual affection between the races that could never be achieved through coercive federal legislation. Like many others in the conservative homeschool spaces, Wilson praised Robert E. Lee as a gracious Christian gentleman, a brother in Christ. Fringe, right? Total fringe. What we see in the 2000s is Doug Wilson getting platformed and defended by the mainstream leaders like John Piper, like organizations like Christianity Today. Piper gives him cover, smooths his path from the fringes into, if not mainstream, shouting distance from the mainstream, right? Piper invited him to his Desiring God conference in 2009, and he's chuckling, noting that Wilson has a way with language. He's a risk taker, but he gets the gospel right. And he came to Wilson's defense in a video on this issue of race. Super problematic, but no, he's going to stand with Wilson, even if there are differences in historical judgments on things like the Civil War and slavery. Wilson was platformed again by Christianity Today and Books and Culture. Now, if we want to understand the race and white evangelicalism, we have to look at all of this. We have to look at efforts, sincere efforts, to address racism, movements towards racial reconciliation and the limits of those movements. We have to see the backlash as well. We have to see the resistance, what that sparks. We have to see the extremists. And we have to look at the mainstream, and we have to interrogate the relationship between the two. That's how we have to understand racism in white evangelicalism. What is tolerated, what is condoned, and what is considered out of bounds. Who still gets to be called brother in Christ, and at what cost? And who gets canceled? We could ask that question today around the issue of CRT. Phenomenal to see this anti-CRT movement just burst onto the scene, except there's precedent. There's a history here. How are evangelical institutions responding? Are they ducking away from potential controversy? What I have found in all the talks that I've given, in all of the public work that I do, that the most vicious response comes when I talk about race. It gets ugly really fast. The only time I've had a talk canceled at a major talk at a Christian college was when community members put together a protest claiming that I was promoting CRT, right? And the president called me and he's like, I know. It's just
the good thing about the division that these people portrayed in the churches and how they were against the civil rights movements. Okay, I would like to know that some were against the civil rights movement. So when they were against the civil rights movement, they were against black people. They segregated black people from churches, and I've said it. But now black people saw to it, okay, what can we do for ourselves? And they see to it that we need to come up with our churches, Due to exclusion and discrimination, black people began forming their own churches. which became central to African American community life. These churches not only served religious purposes, but also acted as centers for social and political organization. Now we are starting to see the new phase of church, the black faces in church. Well, that's good. And this is why churches are important. Now the church that belonged to black people started acting as a social center where black people met. Black people started discussing about how they can survive as a community, because church is an umbrella, right? Of course, nobody will disturb you because it is a church. So when black people started forming their own churches, it was very common that it was easy for them to, plan their things, do their strategies on how they could, grow, come up together. And that's where I now started thanking the church, probably the black church, because it offered the platform for black people to organize, to strategize on how they could beat the segregation, on how they could beat the mistreatment, how they could beat the inhumane mistreatment that black people were subjected to. And it reminds me also back at home our independence. And church really also played a great role in doing this. A lot of activities were happening inside the church, but at least if this was a church thing that was happening in the church, but at least it was human thing, because these are just black people who are being segregated. And now they decided that we're gonna have our church. You don't need to be discriminated because you look black or you look given in a given way. Now having this way, it acted and it provided a forum for them to discuss tangible things inside the black community, how they were being mistreated. And I thank God. That's why we started having social and political organizations that black people strategically used this time. They used this platform because now we couldn't see white people attending black churches, right? Because they are predominantly, they had their churches. So their secrets could remain there. The activities, their planned activities could go successfully because they could find a platform where now they could sit down and discuss about these things. You really realize how this is really important to me and to you.
Bunch of bunk. I know it's totally made up, but we just can't have you here in this moment, right? And that's why I value this event. So I'm like, this matters. It shouldn't be this way, but even convening a conversation that boldly claims, right? Do we want to be healed and says that racism is a problem in the white church? Even that takes an act of courage these days. And more of us need to be doing it, and we need to be risking it. And we need to be risking our own comfort, and we need to be taking what comes back at us, and we need to do it again and again and again. Because that's how this works. And for too long, too many evangelical leaders gave cover to this or decided we're just not going to go there, right? Think of the donors. Think of the constituents. Think of the trouble, right? So let me wrap this up with some key takeaways. Okay, number one, often white people can't or won't see things. They won't see race, they won't see racism. We talk about the success of Jesus and John Wayne. It sent shockwaves through white evangelical spaces. And I get these letters every day. Do you know what the response among black Christians is to Jesus and John Wayne that I've heard? Vast majority is, yep. No surprises there at all, right? And so it takes white women maybe to write these books that are getting a hearing in white Christian spaces. There is nothing new that I am bringing in Jesus and John Wayne. This is history, and mine is based, yes, there's primary sources that were available to all of us, and there's a lot of secondary sources. These stories are out there, right? And some people didn't need to read books to know these truths, right? So one thing we could do is just listen to people, we white Christians, listen to people who are not white, because trust me, they can tell us how this works, right? Okay, so that's one takeaway. 2, race is not separate from faith. In an ideal form, we would love to think it is. And in this imagined, Bevington quadrilateral evangelicalism, there's no mention of race there. It's lovely, it's biblical, it's true, it's all of these things. In real life, there is no isolated, faith, right? It is always embodied, it is always enculturated, and we need to understand that. And we need to, again, talk across our differences as we all seek to be more faithful Christians. Okay, we also need to interrogate the relationship between the fringe and the mainstream. And we need to hold respectable leaders accountable for what they tolerate, condone, tacitly promote, who they exclude, and who they denounce. 2 final points. We need to drop all this worry about quote-unquote white guilt. Attention to structural racism and even CRT, it's not about white guilt. It's actually the opposite. So I'm a Calvinist, and I'm very comfortable with an expansive view of sin, and we've always considered sin to be personal and structural and social, and redemption needs to be all of these things as well. We inherit systems and symbols and geographies and beliefs, right? And finally, another place that we need to look is this consumer culture, like I mentioned before. How is the Christian market defined as white? Because trust me, it is. And how does that shape the Christianity that is packaged and sold as biblical truth? Okay, so I'm just going to leave you with more books to read. There are so many amazing books that are just coming out. Anthea Butler's, which Beth mentioned. We have Jesse Curtis's new book on the myth of colorblind Christians. So important if you want to understand anti-racism and racism in white evangelical spaces. Really critical. Russell Hawkins, Willie Jennings, Jamar Tisby, of course, Mary Beth Matthews on doctrine and race, Angela Parker. I could put, Dr. Malcolm Foley's forthcoming book, whenever that comes out, is going to be really important. So these are the books that you should be reading. This isn't hard, except it is. It also is hard, right? It is very hard. It's harder now to talk about race than it was 3 years ago, than it was 5 years ago, than it was 10 years ago. It's harder maybe than it has been for decades, which is why we have to keep doing it. And we have to do it in community. We have to do so with courage. And it's not ultimately hard because there is joy in it, and there is truth. And this is where we find beloved community. So thank you.
Kristen, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your work and for your challenge to us today, and for giving us a reading list. That is one of the things I hope we are all taking home, is a list of resources, some of the things that we can take back to folks in our pews, in our communities, particularly those of us who come from primarily white communities, where the big question is, how can I learn about the experience of people of color? One quick announcement that I want to make. We will be stopping the live feed as we move into a dinner break. So wherever you are in the world, I would encourage you to do something that feeds you and your soul. And I'll just remind you that what's happening tonight is a little strange because we're going to have some breaks in the live feed. At 7 o'clock Central, you are all here in Central Time. 7 o'clock Central, we will convene in this space for a model about how films about race and prejudice can be used to engage congregations and communities in important conversations. And that this is work that my friend Sean Palmer and I have been doing for years. We're going to show a really challenging film in this space tonight, the 2004 film Crash. Folks at home, we have encouraged you to watch this either on your own or during the time we're going to be watching live here. Because of things like we're not licensed to broadcast this film, we will not be showing it on the live stream. So we'll come back for a very short introduction at 7 o'clock where I will contextualize a few things for the folks here live at Truett Seminary. And then for the roughly 2-hour running space of the film, running time of the film, we will be dark. And then we will come back on around 9 o'clock Central. And Sean and I are going to have a conversation which engages with the film and also engages with some of the practical aspects of doing this work, where you bring a film on race in to help engage people in these important conversations. So, Kristen, we are so grateful for your time with us. Beth, so thankful for your conversation with Kristen. So grateful for all of you here in this space, all of you at home and in your communities of worship, and all of those who will be watching this later. We hope that this is an important and valuable resource for you, and so grateful for your accompaniment on this journey. Thank you so much. We'll see you soon.
So welcome back, guys. I hope we've all watched and we all learned. And first of all, I won't turn my blind eye to the lady for talking about these things, because it is really important, trust me. And this is a topic that we need to talk about. This is a topic that the church itself need to come straight to people, talk about these things. Apologize to black people. Apologize to black people, because God will judge you. And I'm telling you, God will really, really judge you. You know who karma is. So with me, I have some things which really happened during the 20th century. Now that black people started waking up, and a couple of things happened during the 20th century, and I would like to take you through it slowly by slowly. Now, during the civil rights movement, white churches had varied responses. Some supported the movement and participated in activism, while others either opposed or they remained silent. Remember, remaining silent in a situation of injustice is a complacent injustice. So the fact that these churches decided to remain silent in the face of oppression, in the face of slavery of black people, that's when they are guilty. And that's when the church started practicing injustice. Why would you remain silent in the face of oppression? You have some answers, you have some questions to answer, right? So that renders them as guilty as well, because if you say you're doing God's work, and if you say that everything that you're doing is in accordance to what God is doing, you need to reflect that. You can't be a human being and you're giving birth to a God. We need to see the results. We need to see the how is this church helping you to disseminate equality, to disseminate everyone's right equally, right? So the church, for remaining silent during those times, this is really questionable. This is just really questionable. And honestly, I would also like to question that to, the white churches, because definitely this is something that we need to talk about. So I would like to bring to your attention prominent figures like Martin Luther King Jr., who was a Baptist minister, often called out for complacency and complicity of white churches in maintaining racial injustice. The white churches really participated in maintaining racial injustice because they perceived that they need to maintain the white supremacy. So when they wanted to maintain the white supremacy, what will they do? Is to maintain the social hierarchy, the social strata. And the social strata that was there was that the black person the slave laborers, they are the people who are below the social strata. In as much as you believe in God, in as much as you don't believe in God, the church, and I'm questioning a lot of things as a person. That's why we need to see a lot of churches, especially early churches in the South, coming in front, talking about these issues, because really the truth shall set you free. And we need to talk about these issues because they are really, really important. Still in the 20th century, we started seeing a lot of developments when it comes to the perception of white churches. Some white churches began to re-examine their theological positions on race. Denominations like the Southern Baptist Convention eventually issued apologies to their historical support of slavery and segregation, right? Now, the 20th century was marked by a lot of civil rights movements, the Civil War reconstruction, and I believe that some people came back to their senses. And now when they came back to their senses, they realized that, oh, what you were doing wasn't right. What you were doing was wrong. And so they re-examined their position, their stance in racial matters. When they re-examined when they re-examined their stance in racial matters, they noticed that they are wrong. And when they noticed that they were wrong, now they started reconsidering, okay, we are all human, right? God is for all of us, right? Then why do we take these people as subhumans? Definitely. They have the red blood. We have the red blood. We have the same blood groups, right? So they started re-examining what they were doing. And remember, this time, we started seeing there is an uprising, black uprising. People like King Martin Luther King Jr., name them, the uprising was really, really there. Now, there's this wave that came of change. The wave that came with change was a revolution, and that's when the United States started seeing the revolution. Remember, this is the same time that black churches were now being formed. This is the time that the black churches were now being formed. When the black churches were now being formed, they had the power to also execute some things. They had the power to now start interpreting the Bible. And we had black and white debates on the church. That's when the black people now started realizing their power when it comes to relations with churches and relations with their belief and relations with race and historical injustice, that's slavery. Something that really happened years ago, like 500 years ago, right? So, taking you down slowly, like now, what's really happening right now? Right now, what's happening today is the 21st century, right? So today we are seeing a number of racial reconciliation, especially in the churches. Racial reconciliation really, really are happening, and I don't know. It is that it has just reached you, but we're having a lot of racial reconciliation which are really coming to happen. So I would like to take you through that. Okay, in recent decades, there have been efforts within many white churches to address the past wrongs and promote racial reconciliation. These efforts include apologies, educational programs, and initiatives to promote diversity and inclusion, just like what you see in the white professor did. It is called the educational programs because one thing that we need to know, this racial education is really, really important because the injustice was done against a black person. And still today we are having these systemic issues which are really happening. So they happened in the past, they are repeating themselves today. Now, what can we do to right the wrongs? One way of righting the wrongs is having educational programs, maybe inside the churches, just like the one that we've just watched. So you get to understand how things really unraveled during those days, during those times. Also, still, today, some white evangelical leaders have spoken out against racism and have worked to build bridges with black churches and communities. I've seen white churches inviting black priests to also come and have a sermon with them. And why is this really good? This is really good because it gives black preachers, it gives black people a stance to give their side of the story, especially things which were happening during the early 20th century. So it is really, really important to see these merge in churches between people from the black community and people from the white community. And now today we are seeing people now worshiping together in black and white churches. I know there can be still traces of racism in churches, but in the churches specifically, but it's not as that dominant as it was in the white churches during the early 19th and 20th century, right? So still, that doesn't mean that we don't have challenges. We are still having challenges even today. So amongst other challenges, despite the efforts that the white churches are putting to educate their people, to bridge the gap between black and white people, especially things which the church itself participated in pushing for racism, we have still some challenges which are still remaining until today. So many white churches are still struggling with the issue of systemic racism and integrating racially diverse congregation. And this is important. And I understand this. That's why we need to have these talks inside the church. Because some white churches, as I said, in as much as it might not be so dominant as it was in the past, but we are having still seeing white churches sometimes struggling in inviting black congregation inside the church. I don't know why, but it's still there. Though I still recognize the fact that it is not as dominant as it was in the past. Talking about the surveys often show that white evangelicals are less likely than other religious groups to recognize systemic racism as a significant problem, reflecting ongoing ideological divides. I understand the cognitive dissonance which is going on, but we need to go past that. We need to get to know that white supremacy today ain't really nothing. And look at the universal understanding of human nature. How can you integrate? How can you put unity together between black people and white people, especially in black churches and white churches collectively? And that's really, really important thing. And what are really key points of consideration in regards to this topic that I would also like to talk about? Theological justifications. This is something which is really important and we need to talk about it because we're still having theological justification that favors white people until today. So historically, some white churches use specific interpretations of the Bible to justify racial hierarchy and segregation. For example, Satan was painted as a black person and Satan stays down low while God stays up. This is symbolic to social strata or social hierarchy. White people at the top, black people or enslaved people were at the bottom. Black people, black things were being associated with darkness, bad things happening in the dark. It was crazy. And the interpretation was being used at the advantage of the, white people. Also, another key thing that I also highlighted or also noticed in my presentation was segregation and exclusion. And this is really common, For much of American history, black people were either excluded from white churches or segregated within them, leading to formation of separate black denomination. And I thank God that black people didn't sleep in the class. They decided, oh, you don't want us? You don't want us in your churches. Okay, well, we can as well go and create our own churches. We can as well go have our own churches. And so I find this as an important stance for, or as an important decision that black people decided to have in regards to this. I really, really appreciate these. I would also like to talk about activism and resistance. The civil rights movements highlighted both resistance of many white churches to racial equality and activism of some who supported the cause. And as I noted it right before, white churches never really supported the black activists. They never supported the civil rights movements. That's what they wanted, equality of black people, because of the white supremacy that was prevalent before. I've talked about modern reconciliation efforts. I know we've been having modern reconciliation efforts that have been put in place with some stakeholders in the white churches, some stakeholders in the black churches coming to great. And we're also saying today, a lot of churches are not racially inclined. People are just worshiping, praying, and having. And that's a good way to go. But I would like to leave you with this message that the judgment is waiting, and the judgment is really harsh. So, if you're watching this video for the first time, you can consider subscribing to our channel, join our membership, and really get to see what we can offer you. Until then, this is Eugene Stories. Peace, love, and harmony. Salute.